In 1965, Esther Buzzerup said, "Necessity is the mother of invention." But I think it's not just about that, it's about our food. Like, I absolutely love food, but your food desires come from your conditions. You know, it's not just about, it's not just about the price of food, where you buy your food, or, you know, whether you buy fast food. It's all to do with the advertising as well, or actually, you know, some certain foods have almost like a status symbol. For example, like, I don't know, certain types of shellfish, like oysters or something like that. It's very much something that's an upper class thing. But at the same time, you know, 100, 200 years ago, oysters was actually a peasant food. You know, you could just get it down at the local pub or whatever. But also in terms of like our whole relationship with food directly links to our economic conditions. So for example, our obsession with meat and dairy, the reason that it's so cheap isn't because we've got an obsession like we need to have it, but actually because of the food subsidies that were enforced after World War I and II during the rationing years. They actually, those same policies are still the same ones from 60 years ago, and they produce the beef mountains, the milk lakes that they talked about in the mid-90s, and yet they're still only now starting to have some sort of movement on actually providing subsidies for vegetables. And that's where you get the health inequalities. And you know, vegetables are really expensive when they compare it to fast foods. You know, when you're in those economic conditions, your choice between buying fast food that will feed your whole family or like a few vegetables, you know, you're put in those positions not because you want to, but because those are your conditions. So with those economic links, it's very much in the workplaces that you have to. So, for example, Celia was saying about take over Tesco's. You know, why not? We're the ones that make the wealth. We're the ones that make the food. Why don't we keep it for ourselves?
Tesco's is one of, you know, 5 or 6 big supermarkets who, to be honest, sell. I struggle to tell the difference between any of the supermarkets, and yet they compete. They have, you know, trucks that travel up and down the country, taking the same food from the same places to the same places, duplicating each other. And in a way, some of the detail of how that works and how it could be made better is probably best done by talking to people who work for Tesco's and who work for food producers, rather than us trying to come up with the answers today. But one of the things I think is about saying we want some control and some decisions, and some are not about just doing it to make money, but about what do we need and about some planning. Because at the moment, they all make decisions on the basis of what we will make profit on this week. So if we used to have a farm that was producing something that we could make money on, there's somebody who does it cheaper, then we just block that contract, and the whole sort of business right across the world, not just because this is people who are bought across the world, where things are opened and closed down, you win and you lose contracts, you win and you lose, and it happens in the work that we do now, where suddenly you lose contracts. I work in the health service, I might be privatised, we might lose our contract, we might be out of work, they might decide they don't want it anymore. It's that buy and sell, give away, throw away things that means that there is a whole waste. So a large amount of what it costs to do things are not things that we need to spend to do it. And that's why when it comes to the moral arguments about are we eating things that are a bit more expensive in terms of land usage, I think once we've taken the inefficiencies out, we're in a better position to decide, do we want to, to spend that energy, extra energy doing it or not. I think in the current situation, it's a way of morally trying to make you responsible for something that you're not responsible for, as if it's what you eat, about what sort of washing up liquid you use, about whether you have baths rather than showers, that is about blaming you for the system. And I think that's part of trying to make us feel impotent about our ability to change it, because it doesn't matter how good you are, you still seem to get worse and worse weather in a system that's falling apart. And that's why we do have to look collectively to changing the sort of society that we live in.
Because there's some really good examples in this room and round the corner in the other room about the way human beings have always come up with new ideas to making their lives better and easier to live. And there's a whole series of cabinets around there with Inuit technology, and one of the things is a seal gut parka that keeps the wind out, and this is for the spring and autumn when you're collecting berries and things, and it makes it very pleasant to be out when you don't actually, it's not cold enough to wear furs. And one of the other brilliant things they discovered was that if you make your boots with caribou sinews, when they get wet, the sinews swell up and fill the hole that you created by stitching the boot. So you have created a completely watertight boot. And if you think, this kind of technology has been used for thousands of years in extreme climates. But really this is nothing compared to what capitalism is capable of. The amount, we already have enough food to feed everybody in the world. We already have the technology to deal with increased warming. We could solve the problems now, but what you were saying at the back there about the flooding now is a really good example. There are hundreds of thousands of houses built on floodplains now, and they are building 2 new towns in the southwest, both of which are on floodplains. One outside Plymouth and one outside Exeter. Exeter will probably be all right because they've spent multi-millions on the flood defences in Exeter, and they're very good at the moment. But those are still floodplains they built on. But those houses are extremely popular because they are relatively cheap, and there's a massive shortage of housing down there. Ironically, since they moved the Met Office down there and 800 workers. So one of the things, but in the flooding, they're now talking about cutting, they're talking about dredging the rivers to get the water out through rivers faster, and even straightening the rivers so they can generate, to take floodwater away faster. But it will create bigger problems downstream. And George Monbiot's article about this the other day, I thought was a really good example of all the things we could be doing. And he was insisting that tree planting is one of the most important, because it's not just the amount of water that soaks up, but also the root system means that enormous amounts of water is spread over a large amount of land. But the Tories are cutting the subsidies for tree planting. So we have this constant contradiction of the profit motive. And until we, as people are saying, until we get rid of this, we're never going to solve it.
So about 200 years ago, the English clergyman Malthus argued that basically there were far too many people, and especially poor people, having too many children, there wasn't enough food to feed everybody. Now, things have changed a bit since then, and capitalism has been able, through technological development and also changes obviously in social relations all over the planet, to feed an incredible number of people. But that is clearly having an effect on our planetary scale, on our ecology and so on. So what would the future look like, do you think? Would it be, you've got populations that want to imitate the eating habits of the West and eat lots of meat, and that obviously destroys farmland, produces an awful lot of methane. We like having dairy products. We've got an industry, food habits based on dairy products, which also has catastrophic effects in terms of methane production, all those male calves, which we don't talk about, which go into feeding our pets or whatever, when they get slaughtered at birth. So how could we actually, on the one hand, deal with people's kind of sensual needs for certain desires, for certain kinds of food, but on the other hand, on a planetary scale, actually modulate those desires and produce something sustainable with a population that is going to increase at least a little bit for a while, even if there is some suggestion that maybe we're reaching a kind of peak. And I think we need more than saying, well, yeah, we need a revolution. That is true, we take that as read, but what would it look like? How could we do it?
I'm enjoying this meeting because it's allowing me to indulge a little personal hobby horse of my interest in very early human societies. And now I realise how relevant that interest is to actually the future of humanity. And we know, we've all heard people say and said it ourselves, you know, when you do that sort of sad shrug and you say, well, that's progress, when the bosses introduce yet some other machine which makes work more boring, less, and probably throws a few people on the dole, and we say, well, that's progress. In other words, progress inevitably is bad in a sense, and human progress leads us apparently to this kind of situation. And you talked about, and I think within that, there's an idea of human nature and the way in which human progress therefore actually is self-destructive. And just a couple of thoughts on it, because you talk about primitive communism, you talked about the egalitarianism of early societies, and you reminded us that actually class society probably started about 10,000 years ago, I think. And so that means that for the vast majority of human existence, we've actually lived in egalitarian kinds of societies. So it suggests to me that there is some hope here, that actually we are capable of sharing the products of what we produce and working out together how we do it. And so, you know, sort of, I think your thing about Tesco is quite interesting. And I think that in a revolutionary situation, I think the first thing we do is take over Tesco. Now, the next thing we might do is wreck Tesco and do something completely different, but we can't do that until we've taken control of the thing and seized control of it, and the workers in Tesco say, right, get out, bosses, we're in charge now. So I think there's the thing about socialism, I think, is the inherent communism of it. And you also said, Mark said, we can't go back, and I think that's really important, because I think we shouldn't, when we talk about primitive communism, it doesn't mean it was all lovely and wonderful. But actually, you know, also it wasn't so terrible. We have to use the technology that capitalism has allowed to be created in our own interests, in the interest of human need and not profit. And I think that's our task, really. And I just wanted to end with a shameless plug, actually. For Martin is going to be speaking again at an event in London called Marxism, and it's Alternatives for a World in Crisis, where Martin will be speaking about what he's written in his book, perhaps at slightly more length, and we can again go and discuss that more, because I think there's a hell of a lot to say. But also people have talked about so many other aspects of the way in which this system is so brutal to human beings, brutal to the planet, brutal to everything on the planet, and talk about what are those solutions, and how can we go forward and actually have a better world where we treat our own planet in a decent way.
All the scientific evidence says global warming is man-made and something can be done about it. And it's all accepted by everybody, except a handful of people. And one of those people happen to be Rupert Murdoch. Newspapers churn out the opposite all the time. And somebody says, well, if all this is going to affect even the capitalists themselves, what's stopping them? And this is really the contradiction of the system. They're against any sort of regulation. Because what's the key words now? Deregulation and cut public spending. Cut public spending, deregulation. Except for one thing, regulate labor. We want more and more restrictions on workers. You know, I mean, that's the one thing they love to have, regulate it. And it shows how the system itself, right, is like a runaway train which they can't control. They're condemned to do this because each capitalist wants to get the jump on the other capitalist, and they say, we don't want any extra costs on us, right, so we can make more profit. That's the way it works. So the fight for our environment is also linked up in the workers' struggles itself. That's why the cause of all of this here has to be taken up inside the workers' movement, inside the unions, and every opportunity we can to link it. Because when we go to work, it's also about, you know, our lives at work and the environment. It's all connected. The key issue, and I think that Marx really got, was the great contradiction inside society is that social production, we have to work together to produce things in a society where it's privately owned. Everything is privately owned. They own a lot. 85 people own over half the world's population. It's just come out last week. 85 bloody people. It's outrageous. They don't care whether we live or die or anything. All they care about is more money. And that's why this book is so important. Right, that provides us for the argument and linking these different struggles together with a vision of a different sort of world, and what's necessary to key into the struggles to help people have a view as they struggle, as they feel a bit more confident. What he's saying is, because it does seem like such a huge thing, doesn't it, to change the environment. But I'll tell you, people all around the world are having these meetings and having these discussions the Occupy movement, to Brazil, to Turkey, to everywhere you look, they're having these things. So I feel confident. The anger is there inside the system against what's happening, right? People are looking for ways to challenge it and to fight. We've got to be there in the lead of these fights.